Han Yu on mid-autumn night, given to Administrator Zhang Shu of the Personnel Evaluations Section. Fine clouds in every direction. The river of stars was hidden. A light breeze scattered moonlight on the ripples. Smooth sand, no reflections in the still water. I offered you a cup of wine. Your turn to sing. Your song was sad and tinged with bitterness. Before you finished, my tears fell like rain. Lake Dongting stretches to the horizon. Mount Yuji stands tall. Dragons surface, then dive. Apes and flying foxes wail. 9 out of 10 would have died on the hard road to this post. We live in such obscurity here, we may as well be dead. Getting out of bed afraid of snakes, at meals afraid of being poisoned. The air is so dank. Everything stinks of mildew. It seems like only yesterday they beat the great drum at the county seat, announcing a new emperor upon the throne, needing wise ministers. Word came of amnesty, 3,000 miles in one day. Even death sentences were commuted. Those demoted might return, those banished might go home. Those who had polluted the court were gone, only the pure remained. Then we applied for reinstatement, but our superiors blocked it. We were sent deeper into the unwholesome South. Our new titles were so modest, we couldn't bear to pronounce them. In such posts as we keep, mistakes are punished by flogging in the dust. Those banished with us were almost all on the homeward road, a road that's out of reach for us, impossible to climb. Sir, please end your song and listen to mine. My song has a different theme from yours. In a whole year, how many nights with such a moon? Our lives are determined by fate, not by other men. We have wine. Let us drown our sorrows in this moonlight. So we continue with the second of Han Yu's poems in the heptasyllabic old style. Now, again, like the previous poem, this is a pretty transparent one as to its subject matter and as to its language and most of its references, except perhaps for some of the geographical or historical ones. The topic of this poem is pretty clear. It is exile. I think we've mentioned before that during the Tang and later under the Song dynasties, well, the laws in ancient China were pretty harsh. But for scholar officials, they tended to be a bit softer than for the rest, which meant that when an officer had done something wrong or there was some infighting among courtly couples and factions, and one faction was a loser, more than execution, except in some very grave circumstances, the scholar officials of one faction or other were sent into exile. What sort of exile? Mostly they were sent to the provinces, that is, out of the capital or capitals. And the more remote the province and the lower the post, the higher the punishment for the person involved. So the worst types of internal exiles would have been being sent as governor to the extreme south, which had a semi-tropical or rather completely tropical climate, which in a time before antibiotics and before treatments for malaria was sometimes tantamount to a death sentence because of the harsh climate and the miasmatic tropical diseases of the south. Now, we mentioned in the previous commentary of the previous poem that Han Yu was exiled. I imagine, I'm not sure exactly when this took place, but I think it was probably written around the years, the beginning of the 9th century, maybe around 800, because it talks of a new emperor being enthroned, and this is probably the Juanhei era emperor, Xuanzong, who gave an amnesty and allowed some of the exiles to return. So the topic, as I said, of this poem is exile. Two officials, Han Yu and this administrator Zhang Shu, are in exile in the south, probably in the Jiangsu River area, the old heartland of the state of Chu. And they're getting together, drinking, and they're talking about their exile. This poem takes a curious form. Its framework is the dialogue between Zhang Shu and Han Yu while they're drinking wine and enjoying the mid-autumn night. But it is framed, this is a frame, as I said, but inside we get two poetic voices inserted into this poem. One of them is a poem allegedly by Zhang Shu, complaining about exile and about this exile not ending after the enthronement of a new ruler. The second one is a short answer, a poem that Han Yu writes back, which is much shorter, and with the topic of this second mini poem being accept things as they are and try to enjoy and get the most of life. So the first main topic of this poem is exile. There is some landscape description or seasonal description of autumn, but generally that landscape description is meant to depict the harshness of the semi-tropical or tropical south of China, which was so inimical to the life of many official scholars. And that's the main topic. Minor topic, as I said, the landscape, and perhaps the topic of the sub-poem that ends the poem, the idea of make the most of circumstances and don't worry about things that are outside or beyond your control. So let's go now section by section. So the first part of the poem, the first three couplets, are an introduction that frames the poem. It locates our two friends together, enjoying the night, drinking wine, and exchanging poems with each other. Fine clouds in every direction. The river of stars was hidden. A light breeze scattered moonlight on the ripples. So we're probably close to water. It's a cloudy night. The clouds are covering the sky and we can't see the river of stars, the Milky Way. Nevertheless, there is some oblique moonlight at least, which is scattered by a light breeze over the ripples. So some distorted reflection of moonlight can be seen over the waters that Zhang Shu and Han Yu are next to. Smooth sand, no reflections in the still water. I offered you a cup of wine. Your turn to sing. So the water is clear, no reflections are to be seen, and probably Han Yu and Zhang Shu are playing a little game like take this cup, drink wine, and recite a poem. When you finish, you give me back a cup, I drink wine, and I recite a poem. Your song was sad and tinged with bitterness. Before you finished, my tears fell like rain. So this introduces the sub-poem that Zhang Shu is going to recite. It's going to be a sad poem. Yeah? The images that Han Yu employs are a bit trite, like my tears fell like rain is a conventional image. But, well, let's see what Zhang Shu has to say. So the next two stanzas are Zhang Shu's inserted poem, presumably, although this is probably poetic fiction. Lake Dongting stretches to the horizon. Mount Yuji stands tall. Dragons surface, then dive. Apes and flying foxes wail. So we get the locus, the location where the two poets are, more precisely through this secondary poem. The poem starts with two images of Lake Dongting and Mount Yuji, which are both located in the south of China in the Yangtze River Valley, in the semi-tropical south, the area of the Yangtze, of the middle course, middle to late course of the Yangtze River. And in this, we get the geographical location thanks to the lake and the mountain, and we get some of the wild animals that surround it. Dragons, which were aquatic, supposed to be aquatic creatures that dwelt in the depths. They surface and dive, and you can hear the sound of apes and flying foxes in the background. Flying foxes, I imagine the bats. 9 out of 10 would have died on the hard road to this post. We live in such obscurity here, we may as well be dead. So this is a harsh natural landscape, far away, with ominous sounds of apes and flying foxes crying or wailing. It's a hard road to the south, in a time before modernity. The poet is probably being hyperbolic in that 9 out of 10 would have died on the road, but some would. We have cases. And, what people who are part of the capital elite and are now in exile feel is that they're in a backwater shithole. And, we may as well be dead than in this backwater land, far away from court and civilization. Getting out of bed, afraid of snakes. At meals, afraid of being poisoned. The air is so dank, everything stinks of mildew. So this semi-tropical southern area had a bad reputation since ancient times. In the beginning of the Han Dynasty, for example, a very famous intellectual was sent as the tutor to the ruler of one of the states located in this area, in the Yangtze River Valley, and he wrote a very famous poem commenting on how horrible the southern climate was, with its fevers, its poisonous snakes, its humidity, and in fact this writer that I'm talking about died while in exile in this fever-ridden land of the south. Now this became a conventional view of this area, which we might consider slightly historical at the time this poem is written. During the Tang, the frontier of the empire had been pushed much, much, much to the south. And the old area of the state of Chu was now really part of the Chinese heartland. It wasn't an uncivilized border area. There were other areas to the south that were much less civilized and with a harsher tropical climate and forest and jungle vegetation. But anyway, the conventional views of this area are that it's filled with poisonous snakes, one has to be careful, and the food itself can be poisonous for foreigners, for people who aren't used to it. And there's humidity. It's a semi-tropical climate, so it's always rainy, it's always wet and warm, so mildew abounds in its stench. It seems like only yesterday they beat the great drum at the county seat, announcing a new emperor upon the throne, needing wise ministers. So we get a piece of information that again helps us not only to locate the poem in space, but also in time. The emperor, the previous emperor, under whom Shang Shu and Han Yu had been exiled, has died. In the local county seat, they've beaten the great drum, which is only done, I imagine, in great occasions, like the death of an emperor. A new one comes, and that's always good, because when an emperor is enthroned, it is always typical for him to emit an amnesty. So that probably raised the hopes of Shang Shu and Han Yu of being called back to the capital. And this is explained in the next stanza, which continues with Shang Shu's poem. Word came of amnesty 3,000 miles in one day. Even death sentences were commuted. Those demoted might return. Those banished might go home. Those who had polluted the court were gone. Only the pure remained. So a new reign starts. An amnesty is issued. Those who have been banished are allowed to return, and those who had important posts are a priori given the permission to resume them. Exile seems to have ended for the exiles, but not for all of them, as it seems. Then we applied for reinstatement, but our superiors blocked it. We were sent deeper into the unwholesome south, so not all of them enjoyed the emperor's bountiful grace. It seems that our two friends here, Zhang Shu and Han Yu, were not particularly in favor with the new ministers and councillors of the new emperor. So instead of being pardoned, their sentence was made even harsher. They were sent further and further south in official posts, which means a worsening of the conditions of exile. So they moved, now they probably moved to the real extreme southern frontier, maybe the provinces of modern Guangzhou or Guizhou in the southwest, which are tropical and sylvatic even to this day. Yeah. Our new titles were so modest, we couldn't bear to pronounce them. In such posts as we keep, mistakes are punished by flogging in the dust. So new titles, so maybe they were prefects or county magistrates in the ancient Chu area. Now they're given even lower positions, perhaps even less than county magistrate, assistants to county magistrates, almost the lowest rung of the bureaucratic ladder. And besides, they're in a place, I don't quite understand the second image, where mistakes are punished by flogging in the dust. So I don't know if it refers to the mistakes by the officers or the mistakes of the people. But anyway, the idea that is transmitted is that this is a place where punishments are harsher or at least more rustic and less refined, like flogging in the dust. Instead of perhaps being flogged in a court or in an interior setting, or perhaps scholar officials being flogged, which, they would probably, most of the time, they were too privileged to be subjected to such sort of infamous punishment. Anyway, the conclusion and the end of this part of the inserted poem of Zhang Shu is, those banished with us were almost all on the homeward road, a road that's out of reach for us, impossible to climb. So the poem ends on a note of desolation. We've been in exile, we've been sent to an even worse exile, whereas almost all of the others are returning home. So we are miserable, we languish still. How horrible fate this is. Now, Han Yu answers back with a little bit more of optimism, or at least, as he says, he changes a little bit the focus and the topic, probably trying to console his friend and himself. Sir, please end your song and listen to mine. My song has a different theme from yours. So from the get-go, Han Yu is telling us, I'm going to answer you, but in a different tone. I'm going to shift the topic. I'm not going to continue in your vein with lamentations at our exile. I'm going to try to shift the perspective, perhaps to a more constructive mindset for you and me. And only 3 lines. Han Yu's answer is the following. In a whole year, how many nights with such a moon? Our lives are determined by fate, not by other men. We have wine. Let us drown our sorrows in this moonlight. Perhaps the clouds, the fine clouds that were floating in every direction, didn't hide the moon. Maybe they only hid some of the stars, or perhaps they did hide the moon, but they've moved on, and now the moon can be enjoyed in all its splendor. Han Yu's answer is a bit of a carpe diem, of a philosophical message in which it states, enjoy what we have. Yeah, sure, we're out of the court, we're in deep exile, but never mind. We have a beautiful moon in heaven, we have wine here. Let's drink, let's enjoy, and let's not worry about politics, which after all are beyond our control. Our lives are determined by fate, not by other men. This is a very debated topic in Confucian philosophy, in the Confucian tradition. As in all civilizations, in some of the oldest texts of the Confucian religious tradition, there is the belief that good people are rewarded not by God in the Confucian case, but by heaven as a cosmical force for good that regulates and interferes in human affairs. But very soon, even already in Confucius' own lifetime, the Confucians had to tackle with a problem that all traditions have had to face to, including the Western tradition, for example, our Judeo-Christian tradition through the Book of Job, which is the problem of why bad things happen to good people. If there is meant to be a heavenly force that rewards the good and punishes the bad, why does it so conspicuously seem to do its job badly? Why do bad people get good things and enjoy long lives and prosperous lives, and why do good people suffer the opposite, suffer death and privation? One of the disciples of Confucius famously died, Yang Hui, Yang Yuan, died very young. He was the most virtuous disciple, in Confucius' own words, and he died very young. And, this presented a conundrum, and different answers were given. One of the answers, which also appears in our Bible, is the idea that, okay, so the people who do bad might live prosperously, but their children will receive the punishment. So this is one option that also appears in China. This is not very convincing because, it seems to punish people who are not guilty for what other people did who were the guilty ones. Another possibility is to try to dissociate the punishment and the reward. So in the Judeo-Christian tradition, this was very clearly made through the belief in an afterlife where true justice would be meted out. The Chinese did not quite believe in this, so they followed another interpretation, which was also typical of the Greco-Roman world of the Stoics. And the idea is there's a power called fate. And this power called fate is Ming in Chinese, does not depend on whatever good or bad things you do. I mean, heaven can, up to a point, reward the good and punish the bad, but there are aspects that are not regulated by heaven. They're just regulated by chance, by fate, by fortune, whatever. And they're given randomly, which means that no matter how good and virtuous you are not guaranteed to get a reward from heaven. So our lives are determined by fate. This is, the idea that, and here Han Yu seems to be subscribing to it, you were given a fate when you were born, and this fate is unchangeable, and no matter how virtuous you are, how many good things you do, you will have to suffer fate. And, the Confucian tradition generally accepted or adopted this this belief with a caveat, which is okay, this is like so, but still we can't blame heaven for not having the power to correct this, because you could say that adversity is a sort of a test that shows that the worthy are really worthy. So Confucius, I think it's Confucius who said somewhere, only when it's winter can we appreciate the verdant greenness of pine and cypress. That is to say, only in bad times and hard times can we really see the metal and the merit and the virtue of people. Only when you have to suffer is your virtue truly exposed for everybody to be seen, and as a vicarious reward for that, you might get fame and reputation for virtue. So, an attempt at consolation. So, quite a simple poem to read, as I said. Didn't have any complex or dark imagery. And it's interesting because I think it's clearly the first poem in the collection that talks in a very direct way of exile, of imperial exile for a civil servant. And, it shows how bleak the perspectives of working in the provinces in exile were for these scholar officials, cut away not only from service, the Confucian ideal of serving at court, improving the world, but cut away from friends and from civilization.